We've all met them. The person in the office who always has an opinion on everything, even if they clearly don't understand the topic. The family member who suddenly becomes an expert on nutrition after reading one article online. The friend who argues with doctors, engineers, or scientists as if years of study and practice could be replaced with 5 minutes of Googling. And of course, the internet commenter who confidently tells actual professionals that they're wrong. What's strange is not that people sometimes make mistakes or get things wrong. That's normal and human. What's truly fascinating is the way some people cling to their wrongness with unshakable confidence. They're so certain of their brilliance that no amount of correction, evidence, or logic can convince them otherwise. It's like watching someone argue passionately that the earth is flat, completely blind to the mountains of evidence proving the opposite. So why does this happen? Why do people who know the least often believe they know the most? Why do people who lack skill or expertise seem to be the loudest and most confident in their opinions? The answer lies in a fascinating psychological phenomenon discovered in the late 1990s by two social psychologists, David Dunning and Justin Kruger. Their research gave us one of the most famous ideas in psychology today, the Dunning-Kruger Effect. At its core, this effect explains a simple but troubling paradox. People with the least competence in a subject tend to overestimate their abilities the most. Meanwhile, those who are genuinely skilled and knowledgeable often underestimate themselves. The result? The world ends up full of confident people who are wrong and hesitant people who are right. To understand how this idea was born, we have to go back to one of the strangest bank robberies in American history. In 1995, a man named MacArthur Wheeler walked into two banks in Pittsburgh in broad daylight. He didn't wear a mask. He didn't disguise himself. He just walked in, demanded money, and walked out. Naturally, the banks had security cameras, and within hours, police arrested him. When they showed Wheeler the surveillance footage, he was stunned. "But I wore the juice," he protested. As it turned out, Wheeler had smeared lemon juice on his face before the robbery. Why? Because he believed it would make him invisible to cameras. He knew that lemon juice could be used as invisible ink, so he jumped to the conclusion that it would also hide his face from surveillance technology. It sounds absurd, but he believed it with complete confidence. He was so sure of his clever trick that he thought robbing a bank without a disguise was a good idea. This bizarre story caught the attention of psychologist David Dunning. He was fascinated not just by Wheeler's mistake, but by the certainty with which Wheeler carried it out. Wheeler wasn't simply wrong, he was wrong in a way that he couldn't recognize. He didn't just lack the knowledge to succeed, he also lacked the knowledge to realize he was ignorant. That double blindness, being incompetent but also blind to your incompetence, sparked an idea. Together with his student Justin Kruger, Dunning designed a series of experiments to test whether Wheeler's problem was actually common. They brought participants into the lab and gave them tests on humor, grammar, and logical reasoning. After each test, participants had to estimate how well they did compared to others. The results were striking. Those who performed the worst were also the most confident in their abilities. In fact, people in the bottom 25% believed they outperformed 62% of their peers, when in reality, they had only outperformed about 12%. Meanwhile, the most skilled participants tended to underestimate themselves. They knew enough to recognize how tricky the tasks were, and they assumed that if something was difficult for them, it must be difficult for everyone. From these results, Dunning and Kruger concluded that ignorance comes with a double curse. First, it causes poor performance. Second, it robs people of the ability to recognize their poor performance. Or as Dunning famously put it, the skills you need to produce a right answer are exactly the skills you need to recognize what a right answer is. This is why stupid people often think they're smart. They don't know enough to realize how little they know. Their lack of knowledge gives them false confidence. But this isn't just about a few clueless people here and there. The Dunning-Kruger effect shows up everywhere, in classrooms, offices, politics, medicine, and especially online. It affects all of us to some degree, because no matter how smart or skilled we are in one area, there are countless other areas where we're the clueless beginner. And when we're beginners, we're especially vulnerable to this illusion of expertise. One way to visualize it is through what some people call the Mount Stupid curve. When you first learn something new, your confidence shoots up quickly. You feel like you've got it figured out after just a little knowledge. That's the peak of Mount Stupid, the place where you know just enough to think you're an expert, but not nearly enough to realize how vast the subject actually is. If you keep learning, your confidence eventually crashes down into what's known as the Valley of Despair. This is the moment when you finally realize just how complicated the subject is and how much you don't know. It can feel discouraging, even humiliating. But if you stick with it, you begin the slow climb up the slope of enlightenment, where your confidence gradually starts to match your actual ability. Eventually, you may reach the plateau of sustainability, where you've developed true expertise, but also the humility to recognize the limits of your knowledge. What makes this so fascinating is that true experts often sound less confident than novices. Experts know enough to see the complexity, the gray areas, and the exceptions. They understand that knowledge always has limits, so they speak with caution. Beginners, on the other hand, don't see the complexity. They see the world in black and white, and so they sound more confident, even though they're usually wrong. This is why Bertrand Russell once said, "The whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, but wiser people so full of doubts." And it's why Richard Feynman, one of the greatest physicists of all time, once said, "I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned." Experts understand doubt. Novices often mistake ignorance for certainty. This mismatch between confidence and competence has consequences. In workplaces, it leads to unskilled employees overrating themselves and even getting promoted over more capable but humble colleagues. In healthcare, it can lead to doctors or medical students making overconfident decisions without consulting others, sometimes with dangerous results. In politics, it explains why the loudest voices on complex issues are often the least informed. And online, it creates endless debates where people with no expertise argue with actual professionals as if they were equals. Even worse, the modern world makes the Dunning-Kruger effect stronger. The internet gives us access to an endless amount of information, but it doesn't give us the tools to understand it deeply. Reading a few articles or watching a couple of YouTube videos can make people feel like experts, even though they've only scratched the surface. And social media rewards confidence and certainty. People who shout simple answers get more attention than those who carefully explain the messy truth. As astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson put it, one of the great challenges in this world is knowing enough about a subject to think you're right, but not enough about the subject to know you're wrong. This is the heart of the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's not just that stupid people think they're smart. It's that they literally lack the tools to realize how wrong they are. But here's the uncomfortable truth. It's not just other people. It's us too. No matter how smart or educated we are, there are areas where we're the fool on Mount Stupid. The hardest part of the Dunning-Kruger effect is recognizing it in ourselves. Because the moment we think, "Oh, this doesn't apply to me," we're probably standing right at the peak of Mount Stupid without realizing it. The first step to understanding why stupid people think they're smart is realizing that the Dunning-Kruger effect isn't about stupidity in the everyday sense. It's not that people are incapable of learning or hopelessly unintelligent. The effect is about metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking, to evaluate whether your knowledge and skills are actually accurate. And this ability is often missing when people are least competent. Think of it like this. Imagine trying to play the piano. If you've never studied music, you might sit down, bang out a few notes and think, "Hey, I'm not bad at this." But if you ask a trained pianist to judge your performance, they'll cringe at every mistake. The difference isn't just skill, it's awareness. The beginner doesn't know enough to notice their errors. The expert can't stop noticing them. That gap in awareness is what makes the Dunning-Kruger effect so powerful. People at the bottom don't realize they're at the bottom, and people at the top often assume they're somewhere in the middle. But the psychology behind this goes deeper. Several mental habits and biases combine to create this illusion of competence. One of the biggest is what's called the problem of unknown unknowns. When we're new to something, we don't even know the full list of things we don't know. Our mental map of the subject is incomplete, so it feels smaller and simpler than it really is. It's like looking at a world map with only your own neighborhood drawn in. You think you've seen the whole picture, when in reality, you've barely glanced at it. Another force at work is confirmation bias. Once we start believing we're good at something, We naturally pay more attention to moments that support that belief. If we succeed, we tell ourselves, see, I knew I was talented. If we fail, we blame external factors. The test was unfair, the teacher was unclear, the audience didn't understand. This selective memory keeps us locked inside our illusion. On top of that, humans in general struggle with self-assessment. Most of us believe we're above average in many areas. Better drivers, smarter than average, more attractive than average. But of course, statistically, we can't all be above average. Psychologists call this the illusory superiority bias, or simply the better than average effect. It feels good to think we're doing well, so our brains default to optimism about our own abilities. This explains why surveys often produce impossible results. For example, in one study, 95% of managers claimed they performed in the top half of their peer group. Mathematically, that's absurd, but psychologically, it makes perfect sense. The bottom half can't recognize that they belong in the bottom half, so they convince themselves otherwise. The paradox is that confidence and competence often move in opposite directions. At the early stages of learning, confidence soars because we don't see what we're missing. As we gain more knowledge, our confidence drops because we become aware of the vast complexity ahead. Only after long practice does confidence begin to rise again, this time grounded in real skill. This is why the Dunning-Kruger effect is sometimes represented as a curve. The infamous Mount Stupid, followed by the Valley of Despair, the slope of enlightenment, and finally the plateau of sustainability. Beginners climb Mount Stupid without realizing how ridiculous they look. Learners in the Valley of Despair feel crushed by their ignorance. Experts on the plateau of sustainability speak carefully, humbly, with confidence that matches reality. But here's the tricky part. Society doesn't always reward the experts. In fact, we often mistake confidence for competence. When someone speaks loudly, clearly, and with conviction, we assume they must know what they're talking about. Meanwhile, when someone hesitates, admits uncertainty, or says, I don't know, we assume they're less capable. This mismatch is why bad ideas can spread so quickly. In politics, for example, the most extreme and simplistic voices often gain the biggest followings. People who understand the complexity of economics, climate change, or foreign policy usually speak cautiously, acknowledging uncertainty. But cautious voices don't go viral. Shouting does. And so the public ends up listening to people who are confident, not necessarily correct. The same pattern appears in workplaces. The employee who constantly boasts about their achievements may get noticed more than the quiet, competent worker who just gets the job done. Over time, organizations can develop what researchers call confidence cascades, where entire cultures reward boldness over accuracy. That's how companies end up promoting people who talk big but fail to deliver. The consequences can be even more serious in medicine. Studies have found that doctors who are most confident in their diagnoses are not more accurate than others. In fact, sometimes they're less accurate, because their certainty prevents them from double-checking or seeking a second opinion. A medical student who believes they're already skilled may stop asking questions, closing themselves off from the very learning that would make them competent. When confidence outpaces competence in healthcare, the results can be dangerous. And then there's the internet. If the Dunning-Kruger effect already existed in classrooms, offices, and hospitals, social media has turned it into a wildfire. Online, everyone has a platform. A person with 5 minutes of research can post an opinion with the same apparent authority as someone with years of expertise. And because social media rewards engagement, the most confident voices, often the least informed, rise to the top of the algorithm. This creates what some researchers call an expertise crisis. In the digital age, the line between genuine knowledge and shallow opinion becomes blurred. To the average reader, a blog post by an amateur and a study by a scientist can look equally trustworthy. The result is chaos, endless arguments, conspiracy theories, and the erosion of trust and expertise. It's worth remembering Neil deGrasse Tyson's words. One of the great challenges in this world is knowing enough about a subject to think you're right, but not enough about the subject to know you're wrong. The internet has made that challenge universal. Every one of us is now only a Google search away from feeling like an expert in medicine, law, history, or engineering. But access to information is not the same as understanding. Facts without context can be dangerous. This doesn't just affect individuals. The Dunning-Kruger effect, amplified by technology, shapes whole societies. When voters are confident in their opinions on complex issues without understanding them, democracy suffers. When organizations reward bold talk over quiet competence, productivity drops. When healthcare workers or educators overestimate their skills, lives and futures are put at risk. And yet, the problem isn't hopeless. The very fact that psychologists have studied and named the Dunning-Kruger effect is the first step toward fighting it. Once we understand that humans, including ourselves, are prone to this illusion, we can start to look for ways to overcome it. But the key thing to accept is this: no one is immune. The moment you think, this doesn't apply to me, it probably applies to you most of all. The Dunning-Kruger effect is sneaky precisely because it hides inside our blind spots. The people most trapped by it are the least likely to see it. This means the fight against the effect starts with humility, the willingness to admit that we might be wrong, the courage to say, I don't know, and the openness to learn from others. Easier said than done, of course, because society rewards the opposite. Still, intellectual humility is the antidote to misplaced confidence. One of the most surprising things about the Dunning-Kruger effect is that it doesn't look the same in every culture. In fact, the way people overestimate or underestimate themselves is shaped by the values of the society they grow up in. Take the United States, for example. American culture places a heavy emphasis on confidence, self-promotion, and believing in yourself. From childhood, people are told to dream big, trust your gut, and never doubt yourself. Schools encourage participation and assertiveness. Job interviews reward those who can talk up their achievements, even if the reality doesn't always match the story. In this environment, overconfidence isn't just common, it's encouraged. This cultural backdrop makes the Dunning-Kruger effect especially strong in Western societies. When people are taught that confidence is a virtue, they are more likely to overestimate their skills, to believe they're above average, and to project certainty even when they don't have the evidence to back it up. By contrast, many East Asian cultures emphasize humility, modesty, and the awareness of one's limitations. In Japan, for example, students are more likely to rate themselves below average, even when their performance is strong. This tendency towards self-criticism can act as a kind of shield against the Dunning-Kruger effect, because it encourages people to assume they have more to learn. In collectivist cultures, individuals may also be more willing to accept feedback from others, since group harmony is valued over individual pride. But here's the catch: no culture is truly immune. The basic cognitive blind spot, the inability to see your own ignorance, exists everywhere. The difference is in how it shows up. In a culture that prizes confidence, the effect looks like bold overestimation. In cultures that prize humility, it may look like unnecessary self-doubt. Either way, the gap between perception and reality remains. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating twists of the Dunning-Kruger effect. True experts often underestimate themselves. On the surface, this seems like the opposite of what we've been talking about. But it makes perfect sense once you think about it. Experts know enough to recognize the complexity of their field. They're aware of the thousands of details, exceptions, and uncertainties that a beginner can't even see. And because they're aware of these limits, they tend to be cautious. They may say things like, I think, or it depends, or I'm not sure, even when they know far more than the average person. This humility can sometimes make experts sound less credible than amateurs. Imagine two people talking about climate change. The novice might boldly declare, it's all a hoax, or we already know exactly what's happening. The expert, on the other hand, might carefully explain the probabilities, the margins of error, and the parts of the science that are still uncertain. To a casual listener, the novice sounds confident and decisive, while the expert sounds hesitant and unsure. But in reality, the hesitation comes from deeper knowledge, not ignorance. This is what Richard Feynman meant when he said, I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers that might be wrong. Real experts are comfortable with uncertainty. They understand that the world is messy and knowledge is always evolving. The problem is, society often mistakes intellectual humility for weakness. In a debate, the person who says, "I don't know," usually loses to the person who speaks with unwavering certainty, even if that certainty is completely baseless. This is one of the great ironies of the Dunning-Kruger effect. The people who should be listened to most are often overlooked, while those who should be doubted are given the microphone. And it isn't just politics or science where this happens. It happens in everyday life. Think of the coworker who never admits when they're wrong, who barrels ahead with half-baked ideas, dismissing feedback as irrelevant. Their confidence can be mistaken for leadership. Meanwhile, the quiet, thoughtful colleague who carefully considers their words may be ignored or underestimated. Over time, this dynamic can shape entire organizations, creating cultures where loudness trumps competence. But if the Dunning-Kruger effect blinds us to our own ignorance, is there any way to escape it? The answer isn't easy, but psychologists suggest a few strategies. The first is feedback. Because we can't always trust our own judgment, we need other people to help us see our blind spots. This means actively seeking out criticism, not just from peers, but from experts. Of course, that requires the humility to accept feedback without immediately becoming defensive. The second strategy is deliberate practice. This doesn't just mean repeating a skill over and over, but practicing with a focus on improving weaknesses. And for that to work, it has to include clear and immediate feedback. Otherwise, we risk reinforcing the same mistakes while believing we're getting better. Another tool is metacognition, the habit of thinking about your thinking. This involves regularly asking questions like, how do I know this? What might I be missing? And could I be wrong? It's a practice of stepping outside your own head and examining the limits of your knowledge. Socrates expressed this idea more than 2,000 years ago when he said, "The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing." This isn't an invitation to despair, but to curiosity. Recognizing ignorance is the beginning of real learning. Finally, one of the most powerful antidotes to the Dunning-Kruger effect is simply learning to be comfortable with uncertainty. Our culture often rewards quick answers and strong opinions, but real knowledge takes time, nuance, and the willingness to admit what we don't yet know. Developing the courage to say, "I don't know," is perhaps the clearest sign of growing wisdom. Of course, none of this is easy. The human brain is wired to protect our self-image. Admitting ignorance feels threatening, so we instinctively resist it. But if we don't confront that discomfort, we risk living in illusions, believing we're smarter, more skilled, or more knowledgeable than we really are. The internet has made this even harder. Search engines and social media give us instant access to answers, but they also feed us the illusion of expertise. We can read a few paragraphs about a subject and feel like we've mastered it, but as author Tom Nichols argues in The Death of Expertise, having access to information is not the same as understanding it. True expertise requires depth, context, and years of practice, things a quick Google search can't provide. And yet, the lesson isn't to silence non-experts or dismiss ordinary people's voices. The lesson is to cultivate awareness of our own limits, to understand that confidence is not the same as correctness, to remind ourselves that every subject is bigger, deeper, and more complicated than it looks at first glance. Because here's the paradox at the heart of the Dunning-Kruger effect. The people most in need of this lesson are the least likely to hear it. They don't know what they don't know. And so they continue confidently climbing Mount Stupid, unaware of the valley waiting below. The more we explore the Dunning-Kruger effect, the more we see its reach. It isn't just about a clueless coworker or a loud relative at family dinners. It's a force that quietly shapes organizations, societies, and even entire civilizations. The way confidence and competence get out of sync doesn't just affect individuals. It ripples outward in ways that can change history. But before we zoom out, let's address something important. Confidence itself isn't the enemy. In fact, confidence can be incredibly useful. Without it, people wouldn't take risks, try new things, or persist when challenges arise. Psychologists have long known that people with a healthy level of self-belief, what Albert Bandura called self-efficacy, are more likely to succeed. They bounce back from failures, keep pushing forward, and look for solutions instead of dwelling on problems. The issue comes when confidence loses touch with reality. When people wildly overestimate their abilities, they don't just risk making mistakes. They risk doubling down on those mistakes, refusing to adjust course, and dragging others down with them. That's the dangerous side of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Misplaced certainty. Interestingly, research suggests that a little overconfidence isn't always bad. People who slightly overestimate their skills often stay motivated through setbacks, pushing them to practice harder and eventually improve. The key is balance. A small dose of overconfidence can be fuel. Too much and it becomes poison. So what can we actually do to protect ourselves from the Dunning-Kruger trap? After all, the most unsettling part is that it applies to everyone, including you and me. We might laugh at MacArthur Wheeler and his lemon juice robbery, but in some domain of life, each of us is just as blind. The first step is simple awareness. Just knowing about the Dunning-Kruger effect helps. It reminds us that confidence is not proof of competence, that feeling sure doesn't guarantee being right. This awareness encourages us to pause before making bold claims or dismissing experts. The second step is to actively seek feedback. This means surrounding ourselves with people who will tell us the truth, not just what we want to hear. It also means listening carefully when experts disagree with us instead of rushing to defend ourselves. Of course, criticism can sting, but it's often the only way to see what we can't see on our own. Third, we need to practice metacognition, thinking about our own thinking. This doesn't require advanced psychology. It can be as simple as asking, how do I know this? Could I be wrong? What would it take to prove me wrong? These questions build the mental habit of humility. Fourth, we need to get comfortable with uncertainty. Admitting I don't know is often harder than pretending we do. But in reality, those three words are a sign of strength, not weakness. They show that we're aware of the limits of our knowledge and willing to learn. Socrates' ancient wisdom, the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing, remains just as relevant today. Finally, we can train ourselves to value intellectual humility. This means respecting expertise, even when we don't fully understand it. It means recognizing that having access to information doesn't make us experts. And it means being cautious about elevating confidence over substance, whether in leaders, co-workers, or even ourselves. But if self-awareness and humility are the antidotes, then society as a whole has to learn these lessons too. Because on a larger scale, the Dunning-Kruger effect has profound consequences. Take democracy, for example. When voters feel overconfident about issues they don't fully understand, they become more susceptible to simplistic solutions and populist rhetoric. A politician who speaks with absolute certainty, even about highly complex problems, often gains more support than one who carefully explains the nuances. Over time, this can lead to policies that sound good but don't work, or leaders who value charisma over competence. The same dynamic affects workplaces. Organizations that reward confidence over skill can end up promoting the wrong people. Once those overconfident but underqualified individuals rise into leadership, they often make poor decisions, ignore criticism, and stifle innovation. This creates what some researchers call confidence cascades, where the entire culture tilts toward bravado instead of real performance. The long-term result is stagnation, wasted resources, and low morale. In education, the Dunning-Kruger effect can show up when students or parents challenge teachers and experts based on shallow understanding. A student who believes they get it after minimal effort may stop studying, limiting their own growth. Parents convinced by a trendy but unproven idea may push schools to adopt ineffective methods. In the end, genuine learning suffers. And in public health, the dangers are obvious. The COVID-19 pandemic offered countless examples of the Dunning-Kruger effect in action. People with no medical background confidently argued with epidemiologists, rejected expert guidance, and spread misinformation online. Their confidence gave their words weight, even when those words were dangerously wrong. The cost wasn't just confusion, it was lives. Philosopher Hannah Arendt once observed that the most dangerous state in society is when people can no longer tell the difference between truth and falsehood. The Dunning-Kruger effect accelerates this problem by putting the loudest voices at the front of the room, regardless of whether they deserve to be there. So what can societies do? There's no easy fix, but a few changes could help. First, we need to strengthen education systems, not just by teaching facts, but by teaching how to think. Critical thinking, logic, and media literacy should be core subjects because they help people evaluate information more effectively. Second, we need to value and reward humility as much as confidence. This means promoting leaders who admit what they don't know, who consult experts, and who change their minds when the evidence demands it. In other words, we should be skeptical of those who claim to have all the answers, and more trusting of those who admit uncertainty. Third, we need to rebuild trust in expertise. This doesn't mean worshiping experts blindly. After all, experts can be wrong too. But it does mean recognizing the difference between years of study and a few hours of Googling. The internet has blurred this distinction, but it's one worth protecting. Ultimately, the Dunning-Kruger effect teaches us a kind of paradoxical wisdom. The smarter you are, the less certain you'll often feel. True knowledge expands our sense of mystery. It reminds us how vast the unknown really is. The people who sound most confident may not be the ones who know the most. They may just be the ones who know the least. So, why do stupid people think they're smart? Because ignorance hides itself. It's not just that they don't know, it's that they don't know they don't know. Their certainty is an illusion built on gaps they can't see. Meanwhile, true experts, aware of those gaps, speak with caution and humility. The great challenge for each of us is to figure out which camp we're in at any given moment. Are we standing proudly on Mount Stupid, mistaking our little bit of knowledge for mastery? Or are we humbly climbing the slope, aware of our ignorance but willing to learn? The Dunning-Kruger effect is both a warning and an invitation. A warning that misplaced confidence can be dangerous, not just for individuals, but for whole societies. And an invitation to embrace humility, to question certainty, and to keep learning. Because in the end, the most dangerous people aren't the ones who know nothing. They're the ones who know little, but believe they know it all.